I sat in my Honda Civic outside Rachel's apartment building on Maple Street and watched the rain streak down the windshield. Like tears, I couldn't cry anymore. And I thought about how she used to love rainy days when she was 7 years old and would press her small face against the kitchen window and trace patterns in the condensation with her finger while I made her peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles, because that's how princesses ate their food. She told me once, and I believed her then, because children know things about magic that adults forget. And now here I was, 37 years later, sitting in a car that smelled like the vanilla air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror and the faint scent of the tuna sandwich I'd eaten for lunch. And I wondered when exactly the magic had died between us. The words kept echoing in my mind, like a broken record player stuck on the same terrible song. And I could still hear her voice sharp as glass, cutting through the air of her living room, with its beige walls and IKEA furniture and the ceramic owl she'd bought at a garage sale, sitting on the mantel, watching everything with its painted eyes. And she'd said, "You're just another mouth to feed, Dad, and I need you to leave." And I'd stood there holding my suitcase with its broken zipper and the photo of her mother tucked inside the front pocket. And I hadn't said anything because what do you say when your only child looks at you like you're a stranger who wandered into her life by mistake and asks you to disappear? The rain kept falling, and I remembered how Martha used to say that rain was just the sky crying, and Rachel would laugh and run outside to catch the tears on her tongue. And Martha would chase after her with a towel, and they'd both come back inside, soaked and laughing, and I'd make hot chocolate with the little marshmallows, and we'd sit on the couch together and watch old movies, and Martha would fall asleep with her head on my shoulder, and Rachel would curl up like a cat between us. And I'd think, this is what happiness feels like, and I'd memorize the weight of them against me, and the sound of their breathing, and the way the house felt full of love instead of empty spaces and silence. But Martha had been gone for 3 years now, and the cancer had taken her piece by piece until there was nothing left but memories and medical bills and the blue ceramic kettle she'd used every morning to make her tea. And Rachel had moved across town and gotten married to a man named Brian, who worked in insurance and wore polo shirts and talked about his golf handicap. And I tried to like him, I really had. But he looked at me like I was something that needed to be managed, and Rachel looked at me like I was something that needed to be fixed. And neither of them understood that some things can't be repaired. They can only be accepted or abandoned. I'd been living with them for 6 months after I lost the job at the printing company, and the apartment on Oak Street, and the car payments piled up like autumn leaves, and I'd knocked on their door with my pride in my pocket and my hope in my hands. And Rachel had sighed and said, "Okay, Dad, but just until you get back on your feet." And I'd promised it would be temporary, and I'd meant it then, but temporary has a way of stretching like taffy until it snaps and leaves you with nothing but sticky fingers and regret. The first month hadn't been so bad, and I'd helped with groceries and watched their daughter, Emma, who was 5 and had Martha's eyes and Rachel's stubborn chin. And I'd read her stories about dragons and princesses, and she'd fall asleep holding my hand, and for a little while, the house felt like home again. And I'd almost forgotten what it was like to be unwanted and unnecessary, and in the way. But then Brian started making comments about the electric bill and the extra laundry and the way I left my coffee cup in the sink. And Rachel started avoiding eye contact and speaking to me in the polite voice she used with telemarketers and door-to-door salesmen. I'd applied for jobs every day and sent out resumes and gone to interviews where younger men in expensive suits asked me about my experience and looked at my graying hair and wondered why a 58-year-old man was starting over. And I'd shake their hands and say, "Thank you for your time," and drive home, knowing I'd never hear from them again, because age is a disease in America, and experience is just another word for obsolete. And I'd sit in the guest room that used to be Emma's playroom and listen to the sounds of a family that had learned to live without me. The morning she asked me to leave, I'd been making breakfast and humming an old song Martha used to sing while she cooked. And Rachel had come downstairs in her work clothes and poured herself coffee from the pot I'd made. And she'd stood there for a long time, just looking at me. And I'd thought maybe she was going to say something kind, or ask me how I was sleeping, or tell me she loved me. But instead she'd said, "We need to talk." And I'd known from the way she said it that my time was up. And the conversation was really just a formality, like a pink slip or a death certificate. She'd sat across from me at the kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, and where I'd helped her with homework, and where Martha had taught her to play poker, and where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday nights. And Rachel had folded her hands like she was praying and said, "Dad, this isn't working, and Brian thinks." And I'd stopped listening after that, because it didn't matter what Brian thought, and it didn't matter what she thought, because the decision was already made and I was already gone, and I'd just been waiting for someone to tell me. But when she'd said, "You're just another mouth to feed," the words had hit me like a slap, and I'd looked at her, really looked at her, and seen a stranger wearing my daughter's face and speaking in my daughter's voice. And I'd realized that somewhere along the way, the little girl who used to dance to music only she could hear had disappeared and been replaced by this woman who measured love in dollars and cents and saw her father as a burden instead of a blessing. And I'd picked up my suitcase and walked out without saying goodbye, because some goodbyes are too heavy to carry. I'd driven to the motel on Route 9 and paid for a week with the last of my savings, and sat on the bed with its faded comforter and cigarette burns, and thought about calling my brother in Phoenix. But we hadn't spoken in 5 years, and pride is a stubborn thing, and I'd rather sleep in my car than admit I'd failed at everything that mattered. And so I'd lain there listening to the trucks on the highway and the couple next door fighting about money. And I'd closed my eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to be needed and wanted and loved. The next morning, I'd driven to Martha's grave and sat on the grass beside her headstone and talked to her the way I used to talk to her when she was alive. And I told her about Rachel and Brian and Emma, and how I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, and the wind had blown through the oak trees, and I'd pretended it was her voice telling me to be strong and patient and kind, and I'd kissed my fingers and pressed them to her name carved in granite, and promised I'd figure out how to be okay without her and without Rachel and without anyone. But sitting there in the rain outside Rachel's building, I wasn't thinking about being okay. I was thinking about the bank account I'd inherited from my father and never touched, because it felt like blood money, and he'd been a hard man who'd loved money more than people, and I'd sworn I'd never be like him. But sometimes you have to become the thing you hate to survive. And I'd walked into First National Bank that afternoon and spoken to a loan officer named Mrs. Henderson, who had kind eyes, and asked me what I needed. And I'd said, I want to buy a building. She'd looked at me like I was crazy, and I suppose I was a little crazy, sitting there in my wrinkled shirt and 2-day stubble, talking about real estate investments, when I'd been sleeping in a motel room and eating vending machine sandwiches. But I'd shown her the account statements and the numbers that represented 40 years of my father's meanness. And she'd straightened up and called me sir and asked me which building I was interested in. And I'd given her the address on Maple Street and watched her eyebrows rise like question marks. The building was owned by a company called Riverside Properties, and it had 12 units, and Rachel lived in 4B with Brian and Emma. And I'd walked through it with a real estate agent named Tom, who wore too much cologne and talked too fast, and pointed out the original hardwood floors and the updated appliances and the coin-operated laundry in the basement. And I'd nodded and signed papers and written a check and become a landlord without ever intending to be one. And Tom had shaken my hand and said, "Congratulations. Mr. Peterson, you've made a smart investment." And I'd driven back to the motel and sat in the parking lot and wondered what Martha would think about what I'd done. The eviction notice had been delivered by a process server on a Tuesday morning, and I'd watched from across the street as he'd knocked on Rachel's door and handed her the papers, and she'd read them standing there in her bathrobe with her hair in curlers, and her face had gone white as the envelope in her hands. And she'd looked up and down the street like she was searching for someone to blame. And I'd ducked down in my car and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite revenge, but was somewhere in between, like the feeling you get when you finally scratch an itch that's been bothering you for days. I'd given her 30 days, which was more than she'd given me. And I'd made sure Emma could finish the school year, and I'd even offered to help them find another place. But Rachel had called me, and her voice had been different this time. Not cold and polite, but small and scared. And she'd said, "Daddy, please." And I'd almost changed my mind because she hadn't called me Daddy since she was 12, and hearing it made my chest tight and my eyes burn. But I'd thought about sleeping in that motel room and eating alone and watching other people's children play in the park. And I'd said, "I'm sorry, Rachel, but the decision has been made." The day they moved out, I'd watched from the window of the apartment across the hall that I'd rented for myself, and I'd seen Brian carrying boxes and muttering under his breath, and Rachel crying while she packed Emma's toys, and Emma asking why they had to leave, and if Grandpa was ever coming back, and Rachel had said, "No, sweetheart, Grandpa has his own life now." And I'd pressed my forehead against the glass and thought about the weight of words and how they can break hearts and build walls and burn bridges. And I'd wondered if this was what my father had felt like when he'd chosen money over love and power over family. But I'd also thought about the nights I'd lain awake in that guest room, listening to Brian complain about the thermostat and the grocery bill and the way I'd left my reading glasses on the coffee table. And I'd thought about the morning Rachel had served me instant coffee instead of the good coffee she made for herself and Brian, and I'd thought about being called just another mouth to feed like I was a stray dog who'd wandered in from the cold, and I'd decided that some bridges need to be burned to make room for new ones, and some walls need to be built to protect what's left of your heart. Now I sit in my own apartment with Martha's blue kettle on the stove and her ceramic owl on the windowsill and the photo of Rachel as a little girl on the mantel. And I make tea every morning and watch the sunrise through windows that belong to me. And I think about forgiveness and redemption and the difference between justice and revenge. And I wonder if there's a difference at all, or if they're just two sides of the same coin, spinning in the air waiting to land. Emma sends me drawings sometimes, and letters written in crayon that say, "I miss you, Grandpa, and I love you." And I put them on the refrigerator and read them when the apartment feels too quiet. And I think about calling Rachel and saying, "I'm sorry," and asking if we can start over, but then I remember how it felt to be unwanted and unnecessary and in the way, and I make another cup of tea and watch the people on the street below, living their lives and making their choices and carrying their burdens. And I think that maybe solitude isn't the worst thing in the world. Maybe it's just another word for peace.